So drugs, often when people think of drugs, you usually might go with illegal drugs, but really drugs are in our everyday life. We go from using antibiotics to using maybe sleep things, or if some of you might have a cold, we might use some things for our colds. And then we have, obviously, as we get older and have more health complications, we might use different types of drugs to control those. So the definition of drug that we're going to be using is a chemical substance that alters functioning or structure of the body and that is not a nutrient for normal functioning. This is the definition that we're going to be using, and again, it encompasses a lot of things. So for example, it could encompass a green tea or the coffee you drank this morning. All those things are not necessarily nutrients. We don't need them to survive, but they do alter our function. And this definition also excludes things such as a fruit. So if I eat an apple will be served as a nutrient, and it is going to alter, like your blood sugars do change when you eat things, and other kinds of stuff happens in your body, but these are nutrients that are related to your normal functioning, so therefore we do not consider those drugs. The World Health Organization considers their definition is a chemical that alters biological functioning and possibly structure. This is, again, a little bit too broad, as it does not talk about that nutrient factor. So psychoactive drugs, which is our focus mostly, we won't be talking about antibiotics or things like that. We're going to focus more on drugs that alter our behavior, thoughts, and feelings. And in this case, those drugs are classified as psychoactive drugs. So psychopharmacology is basically the study of how psychology and pharmacology kind of blend together and study how drugs affect behavior. So behavior in terms, again, of feelings, thoughts, and the whole encompassing just person. Psychopharmacology also includes the understanding of social and environmental factors and how they influence drug use. So this is where psychology, again, kind of bridges not just the chemical, biological aspect of drugs, but also addresses how social and environmental factors influence our behavior. So who takes drugs? Probably most of us. If we were in the room, and I'd have you raise your hand, and I will just put the word legal drugs. I don't want to know about anything that's not. Most of us would. So we might take it for coffee, like I take coffee every morning. We might take it for maybe various other reasons. Some people might have like panic attacks that might need some kind of medication for that. So there's various reasons why we take it. So most people usually do it to feel good and to feel better. So feeling good might just be like that coffee, again. So I like to feel more awake in the morning. Feeling better might be to actually fix something that is not quite where it should be, such as mood or even anxiety. So there's also the type of people that might take some drugs to do better. So this might not necessarily always be legal, but it might be for maybe taking it for a sport, like some of the steroids, or taking medications that's not prescribed for you, such as that can be like for attention, such as Adderall. And then you have the people that just take it for curiosity, pure influence, and other reasons. So the drug experience is really not just the chemical perspective. There's a lot of things, but first we do have that. So we have the chemical stuff, right? The pharmacological factors that influence, that attach to certain aspects of our brain structure, to certain neurotransmitters. But then we also have non-pharmacological factors. So that can be more so like the mood, some of your individual differences. So for example, people who tend to have more anxiety or kind of be easier reactive to situations often can have more likely to have like a bad trip or have a bad experience with a certain drug. So pharmacological factors, just to break those down, that would be, again, the chemical structure, route and administration. It definitely depends on how you take this drug and how it impacts you, and then the drug dose, how much you're taking. It could go from making you feel a little jittery to maybe having you almost stop your heart. So it can really have a variation depending on all these. And it's a combination of all these three things that really promote that pharmacological factor. Chemical structure of the drug is definitely going to influence, as we know, a lot of street drugs and the illegal drugs out there sometimes can be laced with different chemicals, and that often is one of the factors of why people have poor reactions or end up in the ER in kind of lethal situations. Route administration is huge. When we take a medication or some kind of a drug swallowed is very different if it gets injected or even like the patch. And then obviously the drug dose is also a big factor. Non-pharmacological factors, so this is factors that does not have to do anything with the drug itself, but that's more about the drug user and other aspects. So drug user would be genetic makeup. So some individuals just genetically can metabolize drugs in a different manner. For example, there's populations out there that cannot metabolize alcohol as much, so often their reaction to alcohol is very poor. It might even look like almost like an immediate hangover. So they have those kind of negative effects and not necessarily the buzz that alcohol might bring. We also have age and we have gender, and these two factors are going to influence more our biology, which also influences how we react to the drug. Learning, experience, and expectations are also huge. So as I said, like the ambience, maybe some of your pre-existing kind of tendencies, maybe if you're anxious or if you're kind of mellow, is going to influence how you experience the drug. And then we have tolerance. Tolerance really is impacted by both biology and learning. So tolerance is really how our body adjusts to the drug. It's really meant to help us survive. The reason our body might get more effective over time to metabolize drugs is really because our body's just trying to protect ourselves. So it notices that maybe a certain substance is doing something to us. It's maybe increasing our heart rate, doing things that it notices as not being in homeostasis or being normal, and therefore it just becomes more efficient at getting rid of it as a mechanism of trying to survive or trying to be well. There's a lot of really interesting things that we have now learned through psychology and other behavioral research that have to do with tolerance. That's not even necessarily biological, but kind of this behavioral learning kind of method. So environmental factors are actually something that are very interesting, and that can be very much tied to what we know as tolerance. For example, having a poor physical environment or a stressful one can definitely lead to something we call like a bad trip, so a bad experience of hallucinogen. There's been many, again, research that kind of says that often people who experience bad trips or kind of a bad experience might have been a little bit more anxious about the situation, might have not necessarily been convinced that they should have been there. So there's more hesitancy. Also, if the environment for some reason feels very stressful, like maybe if you have something changes in the environment, that could also lead to more tendency towards having bad experiences. The other aspect that is interesting about environmental settings and how they influence our experience of drugs is also cues. So for example, individuals who might be used to maybe, let's say, drinking or smoking in certain places or with certain groups of people will automatically kind of see those people and places as maybe positive things. So therefore, if you're trying maybe to drink in a new location, or you're trying to maybe drink with people you don't really trust or know, it might not necessarily experience it in the same way that with people that you're kind of used to. Also, different cues impact our reaction right away. So for example, it's been known that like needles for, let's say, heroin users or some of the users that use needles will also provoke an association and almost like a high before it happens. And that's where some of the tolerance and some of the other kind of things come in place. Sights, smells, sounds are also aspects that influence our experience. So examples of non-pharmacological effects, again, overdose can happen, for example, in a novel environment. So it's not just the drug. So what this means is, for example, if a person is used to, we'll just say heroin, they're used to taking heroin in the same location, the same amount, and nothing happens for months, years. They might actually need to take it a little bit more, but maybe it doesn't happen, nothing happens. But then they move to a different location and they take the same amount that they've always taken. That is at risk for overdose. And the reason for that actually has to do with tolerance. So learned cues actually help our brain and our body get ready for the dose. So for example, for somebody who might necessarily, let's say, maybe they smoke in the bathroom or something like that all the time. Going to the bathroom itself, or maybe getting the certain things that you need for that high, let's just call it a high for our sake, will definitely get the body prepped before it even happens. So the brain's already like, oh, here we go again, right? We brought out this needle, or I see this thing, or we're in this little corner again. And what it does, it already kind of preps to get rid of it. So it starts preparing for it and to address the effects. So it counters the effects a lot sooner. Now, if you have that person, let's say, again, we'll just go with heroin, try to use the same amount in a novel environment, then what will happen is that their body won't necessarily recognize. So it won't recognize the fact that they're back in their room doing the one thing that they do in that little corner. So therefore, they might overdose. So this is why, if you kind of think about all the famous celebrities who have unfortunately overdosed or passed from it, often they're like they're either in a hotel or they're somewhere out there, and that's kind of, it makes sense, right? Because if they're common users but in their home, then you would think that their body's a little bit more used to counteracting the effects, and that's called a compensatory response, and that's part of tolerance. So it's basically a tolerance that happens behaviorally because there's no drug coming in. It's just your body reacting to the environment and noticing that it's about to happen, and it almost preps before it begins. So super interesting kind of thing. All right, so the compensatory response phenomena was really studied by Siegel. Siegel was looking at rats and how they were responding to different types of drugs, often drugs that would result in overdose. So he looked at heroin, morphine. I think he also had a couple cocaine addicted rats. So what he did was he basically had a group of rats and he just gave them a bunch of heroin. So little by little it was increasing, so they were all becoming little rat addicts. Unfortunately, they were becoming addicted to a thing forcibly. And they were all being given the same amount of everything, right? Same location, same food, same amount of increasingly heroin. Now what he did though was then give them a lethal dose. So LD100 means lethal dose 100%. So what that means is that this amount of this drug would 100% kill any rat out there that would be normal. Okay, not including these rats that have already been exposed to the drugs, but it would be like a rat that was just never having taken a drug. So it would overdose any of these. So what he did was, though, he gave this lethal dose that presumably would have wiped out all the rats to these rats that had already been exposed to heroin. And he did it, though, in two different ways. So half of them he kept in the same room and gave them the LD100, again, assuming that all of them would die, but of course they already had some of the tolerance, so they weren't all going to die. And then he gave the LD100 to a group of rats in a different room with also a white noise. So it was definitely a different environment. And what resulted was this finding that, again, all these theoretically would have had some tolerance. So we would expect not all of them to die, even though it was LD100, because they all had some tolerance build up from the use of, or the injection of the heroin that had already been given to them. But as you can see, the rats in the one room, they actually, only about 30% of those died from the lethal dose. 60% were still alive, okay, after that. Now, the different room, that was 60% lethal dose. So 60% of the same rats, or the same kind of conditioned rats, died in the different room. So this is an example of compensatory response. So theoretically here, the rats that stayed in the same room, they probably saw the needle, saw the guy coming, they were in the same room, their body was prepped to fight off the heroin being injected, including the lethal dose. For the rats that were not in the same room, they were sort of in a nuanced thing. So they were hearing the noise. They were probably a little like not sure what was going on. They weren't necessarily expecting the dose of heroin. So when they were injected with the lethal dose of heroin, double the amount overdosed and did not make it. Example of how tolerance works, both behaviorally and also chemically. So our environment does impact our biology, which is really, really fascinating. And I think one of the major things that I love about psychology, that we can't really divorce our environment to our behavior, to our natural, organic kind of chemistry. So moving on to some more definitions. Illicit, obviously that changes by locations. Illicit just means drugs that are illegal to manufacture, sell, or possess. Sometimes this can be varied. So for example, we have states that it is illegal to sell, but then you can now possess. So for example, marijuana is kind of in this kind of stage where you might need a special license to make it and sell it, but not necessarily to have it. So it's going to vary on location. Modification happens all the time. Here we have Al Capone. So just kind of interesting little fact about Al Capone. He was a native of Cicero, and that's where I grew up half of my life. So I lived in Cicero, which is adjacent to Chicago. So if you know anything about Al Capone, he was kind of like your, little drug pin in I think it was like the 60s or 50s. And what he made his money off was actually just alcohol. So it was during that period where they banned alcohol, and he became the kingpin then. So interesting thing about him. And of course, this also again varies from location, years, eras. Currently, we're kind of in an interesting place where we have a lot more states that are legalizing marijuana selling or even use. And at the same time, we also have people in jail who are now serving time for things that are now legal. Now we're having people, the overturns and all those kind of cleaning of the records. For example, I think Illinois recently is doing expunging of some of the records for people who served those time periods for crimes that are no longer crimes. So illicit is drugs that are legally manufactured, sold, and possessed. And again, there might be restrictions, so this doesn't necessarily mean that they're just legal everywhere for everyone. And that's also constantly changing. So as we talked about the prohibition and Al Capone, and then some of the different states that have now legalized marijuana. Instrumental use, this is when we're using it for socially approved goal in mind. So for example, when you're using an antibiotic, that's pretty socially approved. You're probably trying to get rid of some infection. I would say that for some people, using alcohol or smoking might be a socially approved goal, depending on the space or who you're with. Falling asleep is also a thing. So again, it's going to probably depend on the individual, the culture, and everything. For example, there are some cannabis products that people use now for sleeping. So you might have, kind of be like, well, I don't know if that's okay. But then we also have a bunch of medication, Unison, all kinds of sleep aid that maybe people don't necessarily frown upon because it's more socially acceptable. Then we have recreational. So this is for means of the experience. That's the difference. So there is a goal in mind, but the experience of the drug is the goal. So this is the positive state of mind, altered mood, drug taking as the end. So like you're taking the drug and that's what you want the drug, not as I'm taking the drug in order for me to feel better, like in terms of depression or even anxiety or... All right, so I skipped a couple terms. Make sure that you read those in the book, such as misuse of drugs and some of the other terms that were in there. The last term that I'm going to go over for this lecture is going to call the placebo effect. So you probably all have heard of placebo effect. If you're in my class, you probably took Psychology 101 or Intro, and we often talk about placebos there. And placebo effect is when we're having a change that is due to a person's belief and not the drug. So this, again, sounds kind of strange, but if I just talked about how just environment can influence biology, so in a way, placebo is kind of a similar thing. So a placebo is literally a drug or it's not even a drug, it's a substance that has no effect on you. So usually it's like a sugar pill, or water pill, or something like that, and it doesn't necessarily do anything, but the people might experience a difference. So, for example, Prozac, which is a very popular antidepressant, is said that about 25% of its effect is really placebo. So what that means is that when they had a group of people, half of them got Prozac, half of them got water pills. About 25% of people that got water pills actually said they felt better, even though they weren't actually getting the real drug. So that is the placebo effect.